Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Scott Keith and Bruce Hillman. We are talking about Augustine today, but before that, you should check out 1517.org and the homepage there. The Thinking Fellows podcast is part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can subscribe to various shows there. There are a lot of them. Bible shows, systematic shows, shows about faith and reason, lots of different things going on. So if you enjoyed this episode of the Thinking Fellows, there's more to listen to this week. You can also watch this show on the Thinking Fellows channel on YouTube and related content with our new In 15 Minutes series on the 1517 YouTube channel. That's 1517 on YouTube. Okay, well, Bruce, this is officially a Bruce episode. So
the pressure's on.
We are talking about Augustine, and this can be a little bit of a, I hope, episode for my dad and I too, because Augustine, probably the most, referenced church father by Luther, and certainly has a little something to do with the Reformation. But we should do a little bit of an overview. We've talked about Augustine in the past, but I'm certain there are new listeners and viewers here, so we should give a little bit of an overview, talk about what Augustine wrote, but then I do want to talk about Augustine's sort of broader influence, because amongst Protestants and amongst sort of, I don't know, basically all Christianity, he's still talked about a lot. And people argue over Augustine, or even in the most recent thing I saw that would have brought this up was some groups of Protestants and even Lutherans sort of excited that the new pope is Augustinian and that could mean good things for Protestants. Now, I'm curious.
It sure meant good things for Luther.
Yeah. So I'm curious why people might think that has a positive spin towards Lutherans or Protestants or what it may be. But to begin, Bruce, who is Saint Augustine?
We have to call him Saint.
Yeah,
Augustine of Hippo.
Augustine of Hippo is the kind of formal name. He's a Berber, so that is, he's a North African in the Roman Empire. He's born in around 354, I believe, and he dies while the city of Carthage is being sacked by barbarians, as Rome had fallen just previously. So he's at this very pivotal point in history where the Roman Empire, he's born into a strong Roman Empire, but he passes away as the empire is crumbling and Rome has fallen. He represents
that's kind of like saying you and I were born into a strong America.
And you're going, and as you die,
I'm not going to comment on that specifically, but
Yeah.
he exists then at this really pivotal point in history, and he also is kind of a gap between the end of the sort of era of the Church Fathers theology and what will become the beginning of medieval theology. And he stands right in the middle of that. He's not a medievalist, and he's not really an old patristic scholar either. He's sort of his own. In fact, a scholar who's kind of his chief biographer, most famous biographer, invented a whole new period of history in theology for this gap, which is called late antiquity. And that's Peter Brown.
That actually makes a lot of sense to me, because I always feel weird. Like, I always feel like I have to double check myself when I call him a church father, because he's so late compared to many of the other church fathers we talk about, right?
At least the early church fathers.
Well, I guess the early ones, right?
Yeah, he's a church father, but
periods.
He's not an early church father. Yeah.
Right.
He's a post-Nicene father.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's one of the quote doctors of the church. But yeah, Peter Brown, so traditionally he had sort of been classified as a medievalist, and Peter Brown really was the guy who was like, he's not really a medievalist. He doesn't have any Aquinas or Aristotle. He doesn't have any of the scholastics. He doesn't have any of this stuff that's very characteristic of the Middle Ages. But he's also far more advanced. He's dealing with political theology, theology of sin, theology of love, that the early church fathers aren't dealing with as much. They're dealing more with issues of Christology. Who is Christ? What does it mean to be Christ and a Trinity. That's really what the early church fathers are dealing with. So Augustine stands in this gap. His influence really can't be overstated, at least in Western theology. After St. Paul, he is definitely the most influential. And all theologians really, whether they know it or not, think somewhat in Augustinian terms about some things within their theology, because his influence is so vast. One example of that that's really famous is his view of original sin, which the East doesn't share, because the East didn't have Augustine. But if you're a Western Christian, even if you're a charismatic Western Christian who you would think would have nothing to do with Augustine, you probably have a view of original sin that is influenced by Augustine. So,
Could you give an example?
An example of
That view of original
yeah.
sin that
So
every Western Christian holds.
yeah. So it's the view.
It's the one you have.
Yeah. No. It's the view that we are born sinful, separated from God and under God's wrath, and that we inherit the guilt of sin from Adam and Eve. This is different from the East. The East does not believe that one is born guilty.
Curious how they might read Romans.
Yeah, we can get into that debate, but the quick version is this. They argue that you can't inherit someone's guilt, someone else's guilt.
It's a philosophical argument.
What you are born with in the East, what original sin, they don't use that term, but what it means in the East is that you inherit death, and that you also inherit a bentness, as they call it, which means that at some point in your will, you will sin and then you will have your own guilt. It's unavoidable. So you're twisted and you're bent, but you're still born without guilt. And they believe that because they didn't have all of Augustine's deep work in Romans, which led to the view that, no, you actually inherit this guilt from Adam and Eve. Anyway,
One might call the bentness in the will sin.
The bentness in the will. So for Western theology in particular, Augustine is the great theologian of the will, and whether we have free will, and how salvation is related to free will, and how sin is related to free will, and how love is related to free will. He really is the great theologian of the will.
He and Stephen Paulson.
with a pit stop of Martin Luther in the middle.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, would Luther have conceived quite as rich a theology of his Branch of the Will without Augustinian influence? And I don't think he probably would have.
I think that'd be pretty easy to say, probably not.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's the summary, I guess, true. I'll give you if you want to talk about specifics. We can go from there.
No, that's a pretty good summary. I mean,
is there another doctrine? Because when you said that, we've all been influenced by Augustine. The first thing I went to was sin. That's like, and then you said original sin. I was like, yeah, okay. What would be the second? What would be another one?
It's hard to say because his influence is so great. I don't know if I could rank them, but another one would be his theology of love. And
okay, yeah, interesting.
So the way I would summarize this is actually I'll use Augustine's terminology, which in his book Confessions, he says, "My love is my weight," and he's actually working with a ancient view of physics. He thinks he's using science here in this metaphor. In the ancient world, they didn't understand gravity like we do. So they believed that a thing occupied the space it does in the world based on what it was made up of, one of the elements. So if it had more fire in it, say, than earth, then it could fly like a bird. If flames go up, they don't. If you put a match upside down, the flame still shoots up. So you occupy the space in the world that you do based upon your elemental weight. And Augustine makes this very profound theology called "My love is my weight." And what he means by that is essentially, if you've heard the term "you are what you eat," Augustine would say you are what you love. It's connected to the idea of the will. And it's the idea that we actually are less chasing things because we're making free choices. Like, I like that thing, so now I'm going to pursue it. And more so that we are always kind of caught up in a type of worship, that love and worship are unable to kind of be disentangled. And so love, in a sense, pulls you towards the thing that you love. So if you love something, you are drawn to that thing. And some of the things that we love, we have no choice in. Our wills are wicked and bent. They're influenced by the tempter, by the Satan, by the world, by the flesh. And it's not just, this is why Augustine argues it's so hard you can't will yourself out of things. You can do some proactive things, like you can form good or bad habits, and that can help sort of lessen the effects, but it can't ultimately solve the problem. You'll need grace to solve the problem of the will. But his theology of love affects all sorts of things. For example, like the inheritance in the church that sex is sort of a negative thing, really comes from Augustine. If you read church fathers prior to Augustine, certainly they talk a lot about like the lusts of the flesh and stuff, but not in the way Augustine does. Sex isn't seen as this very dangerous thing. Augustine makes sex a dangerous temptation because it's caught up in false worship, and because it's caught up in, it very graphically depicts the problem in our wills in a way that everyone can kind of understand. And so for Augustine, love is pulling us in different directions. So I'll give one last example of what this he might mean and look like, what this might look like. So imagine like you're dating somebody, and one day you realize that you love the person. Augustine would say something like, well, you didn't just wake up one day and go, you know what, I've made a pro and con list. I really like this person. I weighed it out. There are more pros than cons, so now I'm making the decision to love this person now. That's not how it works. You love the person, and then you only later become conscious of the fact that you already are in love. You fall into love, to use the English expression. You don't run into it, you fall into it. And this is a picture of what humanity is like in the fall for Augustine. Humanity is always chasing other loves because it's being drawn to them, and it is therefore what he calls a mass of damnation. We are idolaters at the end of the day with everything. And that is our default condition. And so we're actually not free. We're actually slaves to the things that we love. And for Augustine, that's what constitutes the human predicament is we were designed to rest and love God and to worship him. We're not able to be without grace, without God's saving act of grace. And apart from that, we are actually slaves to worshiping things that are stronger than us and pull us in.
I mean, you maybe up until that last part, you very much described, I think, large portions of the bondage of the will too.
Yeah.
So just if you replace the word love with will, or I think one of the things that Luther argues in the bondage of the will pretty effectively is that it's not a choice as much as it's a desire, and this is where the problem comes in. Like you're being ridden, either your love, you're being ridden, your affections are being ridden either by God or by the devil, and this is sort of the issue there. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm an Augustinian on that one.
Maybe I'll talk about one of his influences that I don't think is good, but is very influential in the West. And that is, this is somewhat debatable in Augustinian studies, although I would say more believe this than not. But it's the idea that Augustine invented the concept of the individual autonomous self. There's a lot written on this.
It wasn't Luther's fault. Okay,
it was not Luther's fault.
It goes back much farther.
It goes back to Augustine. In fact, one of the groundbreaking books on this is by a guy named Philip Carey, who wrote Augustine's Invention of the Inner Self. But there's a lot of books on this. But that was a groundbreaking book published by Yale Press, I think. Oxford or Yale published that. Anyway, the idea is that Augustine has a rich inner world. That's true. If anyone's read Augustine, you know that that's absolutely true. And for Augustine, the way you encounter God is that God first comes to you, usually in his word. It could be through the preacher. Augustine, it could come through a dream or a miracle, but it mostly comes through the word. And then that grace makes you alive in Christ. Okay, all's well with Luther and Augustine on this point so far. Where now the departure starts to happen is Augustine believes, though, that Christ lives inside you because now you love God more than you love the world because you have the Spirit.
It's degrees.
Complete changing of the will.
Yeah. And that means that because the Spirit is inside you and God is inside you, that you find God inside you. Now, what does he mean by that? He doesn't mean that the Bible or the Word isn't the place where you find God. That's where you get information about God. That's where you get truth about God for Augustine. Only Scripture. But where you actually experience God as a lover, as one who, and you find assurance in God because you love him and he loves you, is inside yourself. You look inside and then you look up. So you look in and you look up. And I won't get too deep into this. He's highly influenced by Plato and Platonism in that where the soul, this idea of the soul as an intellectual force within us, is turned inwardly to look at God who dwells within us. So there's all this philosophy and theology that he's working with that was kind of assumed in the ancient world at his time, which is why he makes this leap. But what that does, the consequences of that are pretty big and I think pretty bad in Western culture, because he makes the how you think about yourself as the most truthful and authentic space. So if I'm insecure, or if I want assurance, or if I want to feel confidence, or if I want to know who I truly am, questions of identity, all this stuff, Westerners now look inside and they say things like, well, I only have to be true to myself. That's Augustinian. That's very, very
find
Augustinian.
The truth inside you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Luther.
Can you grab me something? Can you grab me that book?
Luther is exactly the opposite.
Way over there.
Luther wants us.
I'm just making him grab promotional material for me.
Oh, okay. I was going to say Luther's exactly the opposite, because he is always pointing us to what is outside our. So it is Christ and the Word of God outside of us, unchanging, always there, which we can grab
and preached onto you.
Preached onto you, and you can grab. Your faith can grab hold of those promises and grab hold of Christ outside of you. Because as Luther learned, because Luther was a good Augustinian monk before he was as a reformer, you can't get to the end of the inside. You can't find assurance there because you can always find your sin. You can always find God, but you can also always find your sin. And did he ever try?
Yeah.
And, he had basically a psychological breakdown trying to do that. He really needed the Word of God outside of him. So this is a legacy from Augustine that I don't think is good, but you can see it all around.
Luther's conclusion of a psychological breakdown when you chase this too far is almost universal when people chase this too far as well. And so I think it's funny. I think it's awesome in a way to be able to say, hey, look at where Luther went with Augustine on this and this, but look at where he woke up and broke from Augustine on this, because it shows that that Luther wasn't just like an updated Luther, just much like Christ wasn't an updated Moses, right? There's something else there. There's some other genius to Luther's theology and to his reawakening of Pauline theology that was not in Augustine.
Interesting that you might talk about Luther being an Augustinian, because he happened to go to a meeting of Augustinian friars in 1518, where he, and you can read all about that in this book called Theology of the Cross, which includes a translation of Luther's 1518 Heidelberg Disputation, where he was disputing with other Augustinians. And the only reason I bring it up is because you can see Luther's beginning departures from Augustine here, but not all the way yet. which is sort of maybe an argument for why theology of the cross or theologian of the cross doesn't kind of continue later in the Reformation in its use, or you don't see the term a lot past like 1521 or at all, really. And that's because in this, the theologian of the cross is about viewing something. So Luther makes a pretty hard shift, Bruce, on what you were kind of saying, which is from the viewing of the inside for assurance to the viewing of the cross instead. So he begins his departure from Augustine by saying you gotta fix your vision somewhere else, and needs to be external, and it needs to be on the cross. If you fix your vision internal, actually what you're going to find is what Augustine talks about elsewhere, which is just that this will is corrupted, and this is also sort of his move away from this grace as well, where grace isn't really a substance. So
Well, it's not a thing that improves you.
yeah, and so if you look inside, you're not going to find that grace to work with that then gives you, or find God's comfort in there. You need to look external to it. Eventually, I would say one of the total breaks with, and there's a great book about this, Marco Baroni, Luther's Augustinian Theology of the Cross. It's really good. I talked about it on the show before. I think I reviewed it for Lutheran Quarter. No, Logia. I reviewed it for Logia. But he makes an argument. He basically pulls the appropriate sections from Augustine that Luther's working with here without necessarily quoting them in here, and does a good job. But the full break becomes something you've also sort of alluded to here, Bruce, which is that Luther breaks with this vision motif for a hearing. The organ of salvation changes, or the organ of comfort changes in Lutheran theology from seeing, where one can even and you can actually see this develop in scholastic theology too, with Aquinas, where the organ of comfort and salvation and grace is really the eyes, to it's the ears. It is the preaching, it is the word received through the ear that brings comfort, rather than seeing grace in yourself, seeing grace in your life, or even seeing grace in the sacraments or something like that.
Would you say that
it's
for
the receiving of the word?
Augustine, that's the heart, Bruce, not the eyes? I mean, we're maybe stretching here a little.
Yeah, no, I
out
think
a
that.
little bit here, but
So here's what I would say: if you were looking at Augustine all on his own, I would say the heart. If you were trying to compare what kind of Luther's trying to say versus what Augustine's trying to say, I would say the eyes, because Luther says you look in and then look up, and your soul sees God.
Augustine says that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on the context, I think. He's
And
very
Luther
much a theologian
messes
of
with
the
that.
heart overall, but I think when it comes to
and the sort of experience of the change in the heart and the effect of grace and all of that.
And Luther messes with that in the theology of the cross, right? He actually, one of the ways you can see he's appealing to all this Augustinian stuff is you get some of Luther's really early ideas about the will in here. That, it's not the fully formed bunch of the will yet, but you can see it's already sort of headed that direction. He's just saying, the theses actually start by looking in, but it starts with this new motif of what happens when you look in and it's under the law, and you realize that the law is actually your enemy and moving forward in righteousness and not your friend. And then what happens when you realize that your will and your heart are actually totally corrupted by sin and not just like need to be overcome moderately by sin? Well, then looking in can't enable you to look out. You actually, the whole time, Luther says, you actually only needed to be looking out. Eventually, again, the looking gets ditched for hearing, and overcome by the ear, which is why I think one of the reasons theology or theologian of the cross kind of disappears later. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting shift where he works with the Augustinian categories, but there's an obvious break in the Reformation too from Augustine.
Yeah, the Reformers Calvin too, are deeply indebted to the kind of groundwork and the context that Augustine sets, but they are their own thinkers, and they certainly go their own way. Interestingly, the Catholics also try to use Augustine to show the errors, what they think are the errors of the reformers. So everybody's kind of using him at this time to their advantage to try to say, no, we're the true theologians, the true church, which shows already by, at the very least, it shows already by the Reformation time, he is the kind of chief influence and theologian that everybody wants to claim as their own.
People like Paulson could correct me, and maybe even Caleb on this, but I think that throughout Luther's career, his reliance on Augustine and Augustinianism wanes. And so you see sort of, I think, clearer comparisons in the early Reformation, but by the time of what you might call for Luther's lifetime, sort of middle Reformation and after last decade and a half of his life, I don't think you see this as much anymore. You see a fully formed Luther as theologian of the Bible more than you do Luther as former Augustinian monk. I could be wrong on that. I'm not a Luther scholar, but this is in my reading of Luther. I hear less of it in sort of later versions of what Luther wrote than I do early. You hear a lot of it early. Like if you're listening to Luther talk early, you can do a lot of what we've been doing here. It's like, oh yeah, that's there. Less of that later.
I think you're right. I would reframe it though, maybe because I think really what's happening is Luther's becoming more confident in his own hermeneutics, his own way of reading and interpreting, and doesn't need to kind of claim Augustine anymore. At the same time,
makes total sense, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, if you kind of compare what Luther's writing to anyone in the East or to
it's distinctly Augustinian.
It's still distinctly. So there's like a quiet Augustinian influence that's almost like a magnetic field that's always working in the background.
That'd be like saying, in maybe I quote him more now. I don't know. In my youth, I would quote a lot of Rod, and now you just kind of feel like you try to embody what he taught you in your own way. And you can see that. That's kind of what I'm saying in Luther. But I do think Luther becomes more in his later years like almost a straight up Bible guy. That makes sense. I think the difference between like what Dan Price does and what a systematician does, there's definitely theology there, but it's always from the context of a scriptural argument.
In this sort of vein, I find one of the interesting kind of stories of the Reformation, or maybe just like developments, that is always funny to me is in the early Reformation. I think you're right. You see actually Luther relying on Augustine a lot, even working out like that this is maybe going to be Augustinian, like even in this theology of the cross in these early
or that
disputations.
This is going to be an Augustinian fight.
This is going to be Augustinians arguing over interpreting Augustine, and Luther's going to go a direction. And then this young humanist Greek scholar comes in, and he's got like beef with Augustine right off the bat. Like Melanchthon does not like Augustine, kind of somewhat famously says it pretty regularly right off the bat. Luther then, I think as the Reformation goes on, just a couple weeks ago, maybe it was a couple months ago, Paulson and I had an episode in Outlaw God called Ditching Augustine. And it's sort of where Paulson talks about the sever Luther makes with Augustine in the bondage of the will. So because we had an episode before that, where Erasmus is opining that, wow, Luther, this is all cool. Too bad you made it up and nobody in the church has ever agreed with you on the will. And Luther goes, gotcha, Augustine did. And then we move forward to Paulson then explaining where Luther makes the break with Augustine. So I think you see.
And what did Paulson say? What we've been saying?
Yeah. I think I think a lot of it has to do with grace. Luther is actually harder on the will and not a transformation of one will, but we end up with the simul sort of as that experience.
And also there's a difference. I said Luther talks about the will in terms of affection, but it is not synonymous with love for Luther either, which I think it is for Augustine. Yeah. There's it's that whole translation of it into will sort of does embody choice too, but it also embodies affection. And I think there's some of that, as Bruce was describing in Augustine, where part of the reason why your love being such a problem is because the actions then follow.
Well, and in the
And this is why you can develop habits that will help you do that, to essentially stay away from what you love.
and in the Reformation, there's
There's a lot of personal stuff in there for Augustine too that we missed. Why that's such an issue for him.
there's two words for will commonly used in that period of theology.
Melanchthon uses one and Augustine uses the other.
Yeah,
not Augustine. Luther uses the other.
Luther uses the one that Augustine uses with arbitrio, which has to do with desire more, or
Affection.
The heart. And bondage of the will is about that the heart has to be changed. But there's certainly, I think, a departure. And what I was trying to say is though, as time goes on, Melanchthon, as he kind of expands his systematics, I think he started off really hot against Augustine and then ends by adding a couple more agreements with Augustine, particularly on the will. I think Melanchthon is a bondage of the will guy ultimately, but ends up sort of with Augustine on distinguishing between the will and reason more directly, and choice a little more directly too.
Well, Melanchthon later establishes a difference between what you would say affection and choice, which is early on when he uses the other word, which is voluntas or voluntas. They kind of are enmeshed more. But later on, he'll make more of a. I mean, by later, we're talking 1530s, not that much later. Make some distinctions there.
Yeah. So I definitely think it's interesting that as the will conversation comes up in the Reformation, Melanchthon begins to adopt a little bit more of the distinction that Augustine has in the creature, and Luther says, "Nah, we'll just scrap this part more and more." And so they kind of are in this inversion with Augustine, which is a sort of interesting turn in the Reformation. Though I would never say that Melanchthon becomes an Augustinian. I think his beef with Augustine on grace lasts the entire Reformation, which is definitely
Melanchthon is so forensically oriented when it comes to righteousness and justification that there's no way he's going to come. He's not going to come anywhere near Augustine. He's just not. He is the scientist in the room, and he's saying these two chemicals don't mix.
So, Bruce, that actually brings me to my next sort of kind of question for you that is back to some of the stuff I talked about at the very beginning of the show, which is this kind of thoughts have been circulating for me because of the Pope thing, which is one of the titles for Augustine is the Doctor of Grace. And as I've sort of alluded to...
Or just the great doctor.
But I want to focus on the grace thing. Whoa, you're stealing the... No, okay, Doctor of Grace. All right, and so I want to lean on this grace thing, because as I pointed out here, just briefly, Melanchthon has at least some difference with grace, and which the Lutherans pick up within our confessions, our doctrine of grace. And so when the Pope was selected or elected, however they...
ordained,
or magic fairy wand was waved over him, and he became the Pope. The Pope Bob, for those listening, but the excitement seemed to be over grace. It's like, hey, listen, like Lutherans, we're about grace, and even the Reformed, we're about grace, and now we've got a grace Pope because we got an Augustinian Pope. Is that actually sort of like a real uniting factor here between the Protestant traditions and Augustinian theology, or is that sort of like a false hope?
I think it depends on what Protestant quote unquote tradition.
Yeah,
it's not going to help you with confessional Lutherans.
I think if you accept the fact that Catholics are going to remain Catholics and Protestants are going to remain Protestants, if you take that as your default presumption, then you can say well, it's probably better if they have works and grace, and they're going to stress the grace side more than the works side. As a Protestant, you would say, oh, of course, if that's how the theology is going to be developed and spoken, and it's going to make people trust more in Christ than in their own behavior, well, then that's still a good thing, even if, of course, it's not going to become Protestant. So if you're someone who's like, well, it's polishing a turd, it doesn't matter because we think it's just wrong. Well, then, okay, then it's not going to make any difference. And
the phrase lipstick on a pig comes to mind.
There's different metaphors we can use here. But I think, I don't know what people always mean when they say, oh, they're excited because he's an Augustinian. I'm sure that's different for different groups and different people. If what they mean by that, which is, I'm just guessing the majority of people mean by that, is like, oh, he's going to stress love and tolerance and joy and happiness and not be judgmental. First of all, that's not what any true Augustinian would think their Augustinianism means. That's a caricature of grace and of love that then is, put on anyone. It could be Protestant or Augustinian, or you just think that what the word grace means is you have to be tolerant and love everybody all the time. And it
becomes synonymous with gracious.
Exactly. It's just it's a cheapening of what people really think. So I think that's probably what a lot of people mean. If they don't mean that, though, and they genuinely understand a little bit about Augustinianism and they're excited about that, then I think that the advantage could be, as I said earlier, that, well, let me back up for a sec. So for Augustine, it's hard to know. If Augustine could have sat down with Luther on the question of grace,
and they actually talked about the Bible,
would Augustine have actually agreed with Luther?
Perhaps.
Yeah, really, I could see it going either way. Because we kind of like to, because Augustine remains in our imagination a Catholic, we kind of redact back on him the Trentian Catholicism as if he was a Trentian Catholic. Certainly, you can find things in Augustine that match with Trentian Catholicism, but you can also find things in Lutheranism that match with Augustine. So we just have to be a little careful at assuming that Augustine just is a full Trentian Catholic in and of himself. And if it's the case that he's not necessarily or is fated to have to be that, then there's a understanding perhaps that Augustinianism in general certainly does lean more towards finding all your hope and grace in God, who, apart from your will, brings you to salvation. And that's not what you find in Aristotelianism or in Aquinas. It's not to say that Aquinas is directly opposed to that, but I'm just saying the Augustinian accent mark, that kind of the emphasis of what makes an Augustinian is this idea that you are saved by this grace that comes to you, that God provides, and then in the Augustinian mindset empowers you. But it's still, God is indispensable to the whole formula of salvation. It's less of a works stress within the Catholic system than anything else they have. So if that is the type of Augustinian that Pope Bob is, then Protestants are going to really like that he'll be stressing that more.
Wait, I'm just going to say, Bruce, that was a lot of lipstick. I have a question. So I have a comment. And
they're really big lips because it's grace and love.
I want to say I really appreciate that Bruce went along with the Pope Bob thing. I felt like that was going to be too low brow for Bruce, and
he probably likes being called Pope Bob.
Yeah. He's from Chicago, after all.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, the question isn't like in reference to Pope Bob as an Augustinian, what did Augustine think? The question is more along the lines is, what is Pope Bob as a modern version of an Augustinian? How does this influence the discussion? Because modern versions of Augustinians are certainly tridentine in their outlook, right? Even if they're not, they're not wholly just followers of Augustine. They've had to adopt all the councils and the decrees that have happened
Yeah.
ever since. And so there's going to be that, Tridentine is a lot, and also Vatican I and Vatican II flavor still like floating around in there. And here's my question is, maybe not in Augustine properly, but within, and maybe you don't know the answer, within modern Augustinian teaching, how does one acquire this grace? Because within Tridentine Catholicism, that is wrapped up with works. The acquisition of grace is wrapped up with works, at least in as much as the works of going to the sacraments are involved. Right?
So I'm not an expert on modern Augustinism, but I know a little bit about it. And from what I know about it, an Augustinian would still say, and this is what makes, so within the Catholic Church, right, you have the Dominicans, you have friars, you have Augustinians, you have Thomists, you have all these different groups. And they really do, the reason you have all these different tribes is they really accent a specific feature of Catholic theology over and above others. And the Augustinians still do feature the idea that if you're talking about crossing from darkness to light, like non-believer to believer, particularly in a rational adult and not a cradle baptism, then the Augustinian feature is going to be that God is coming to you through his church, which is through the preached word.
Really? Interesting.
It is the word. Now, they're not going to always label it as just the word. Like
it's not even one of their sacraments, so I kind of
Well, that's how it comes through the church.
It's not even one of their means of grace.
Yeah, it can come through the church, certainly in Augustinism, but the accent, the feature, is going to be that God finds you through, it could be a series of people, it could be through a message, could be through reading the Bible, it could be through a dream or a vision, but either way, it's going to be
inordinate, gracious role models in your life that
it's
maybe
not
pointed
going to
you
be
to
because
generic
you were
God.
a rational agent who chose it. It's not going to be because of
Okay,
that.
so can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
Is grace still within this Augustinian structure more of a substance, something that is given
that's
to
the
you,
big break.
rather than as my dear Melanchthon likes to put it, this attitude on the part of God by which he sees you righteous even though you're not?
Exactly. So in the Lutheran tradition, grace is essentially God's declaration, his verdict from the bench where he says not guilty, and he hits the gavel. And it doesn't matter what you feel or think about the verdict.
That was so forensic, it made me happy.
The verdict is there. But in Augustinianism, it's not grace is the actual power to move your affections, your heart, and your reason to believe in God.
Yep.
And so that's why you look inside. You go, do I believe that Jesus died for me? Yeah, I believe that. Okay, then you're saved. You look inside and you interrogate yourself there because God is in the soul, and the soul is the part of the person
Or unlike
that loves
Luther,
and believes.
I've been baptized, my sins have been forgiven. These things have been done over me, to me.
And they're not just dispensing grace.
I can
they're because...
remember them. I can I can embody them in my remembrance of them. Yeah.
Well, and they're not dispensing grace in the same way. They're from God's grace. So, and I think that's a big part of it. And it's also why, as you were saying, with all the sort of the councils and with Trent and all the affirmations, that Augustinians can still fit in there because faith can still be formed by love and works towards. They're just enabled by that initial moment of grace that wasn't by your free will. And so
Sorry, go ahead.
Go for it, Bruce.
No, I was just going to say, so the metaphor that Augustine uses quite a few times about grace is that you're on a road and you're walking towards a city, and the city is hell. You can't not walk in that direction. in the metaphor. And then grace is where God essentially comes down and he turns you around on the road so that you get a beatific vision. You see heaven, you see your true home, the home that you thought you were moving towards when you were going towards hell. You thought that's where you needed to go. That was your home. And now you realize that's hell. That's not my home. And so grace not only turns you around, but is sort of like a motivator to keep you heading home. But you have to keep heading home. There is a sense where your will has now been transformed to desire and love and want to go home. And on that way home, Augustine says, there's all these sort of distractions that are trying to get you back to hell. And grace is what's going to help keep you going. So if you don't have access to the church and you're not praying, you're going to lose
Habits.
this grace essentially, and
If
you're
you
going to
don't- if
be
you're not
tempted.
participating in the spiritual habits.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So
Thank you, Melanchthon.
Can we try to? I can try to Lutheranize this a little bit because there's parts of that we wouldn't necessarily block. In fact, there's parts of that are what I was taught when it comes to repentance and regeneration, even at a Lutheran university. So you're heading on this road to perdition. The preached word or the preached word connected to water and baptism comes along, and you're picked up and you're churned around. But instead of sort of you developing habits that keep you on the road throughout sort of the many trials and temptations of your life, the preached word, the absolution, keeps smacking you around and turning you back around in a sense. Now, that's not a great metaphor for Lutheranism, but if you were going to try to do the same one, it's a little closer to the idea that you have to develop spiritual habits within you that will keep you on the road and free from temptation and will grow grace in you, than that the preached word outside of you, either just preached or connected to the sacrament in the Lord's Supper, or connected to absolution, where that preached word is put over you in the words of, confession and absolution, forgiveness, that it really, that law and gospel continually convicts you and keeps turning you back around. And there's sort of the distinction in there with the saint sinner, where you still need that. You still need that law.
But it's the sinner who needs the law.
The sinner that needs the law, and the gospel then always sort of reinsaints you.
Can I add where I see sometimes this sneak back into
Again,
Lutheranism
for those
a
that
little
are
bit?
listening, that's not a good metaphor. I was just trying to use the same one.
No, but you can see where this can sneak back into Lutheranism a little bit. The infused grace without infused grace, if that makes sense. When these conversations about preaching the law to the Christian come up, which everybody affirms, and this sort of straw man of antinomian out there who denies that is basically non-existent. I mean, there's like there's like one example in the Reformation.
There's one dude out there.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe there's
always
one dude
one.
out there today. But
The true antinomian.
the true antinomian.
Our hashtag still a thing.
But where the disagreement can come is, are you preaching the law to the new man or to the old man? And when you have this sort of infused grace, like if you're in the Roman Catholic Church, the answer is, of course, the new man. It is, you are motivating him with the law. You are educating him with the law. And
To
because
develop these spiritual habits.
and because he has this vision of grace,
to keep getting bucketfuls of grace in
and
the sacraments.
if you stay in the life of the church and your vision is on that, then that law will help you move forward. In Lutheranism, though, our confessions, please comb through them, especially the formula, which talks about this pretty much endlessly, talks about that it's actually because life is a struggle, and because the sinner is not fully gone yet, and because the regeneration hasn't been totally completed, and over again. I mean, the formula in particular talks about preaching the law in a lot of its different articles, but it always talks about, and because you sin, this. And that's because there isn't a grace inside you that can then cling to the law and make it friendly and move you forward. In fact, you don't need any moving forward. The new man is, you are saved.
You're picked up and you're put on one of those like people movers in the ground.
Yeah.
You're not even walking anymore.
And so So yes,
in an
you
airport.
have to preach the law. You have to preach the law because we remain sinners. You don't have to preach law because we've been infused with this power of grace. And so I think that's one of those distinctions there where, of course, we're going to agree with every Orthodox Christian that the law is to be preached and taught to Christians. But when you separate on this issue of grace, a lot of different things change about your perspective on that. And I do think it's one of those places where, I think you can say, hey, at least I guess there's an Augustinian, but in one sense, there's some key doctrines where definitionally we disagree. So
It's always dangerous using a word like grace
yeah,
when you mean something completely different by it. Like, can we agree? It's like you go to Catholic. Can we agree that grace is really important? Well, yeah.
or even you'll hear
But
that
you're talking about two
Augustinians,
totally different things.
Or-
Like, it's like if grace meant both a car and an airplane.
you'll hear like I heard this right that Pope Bob, that if he's like a true Augustinian, a lot of Augustinian Catholics will go, yeah, of course you're saved by sola gratia,
Yeah.
grace alone.
Yeah.
And it's like if we mean different things by gratia
Yeah.
there, then this is this is an actual unity that could be available.
It's like every debate. First, define your terms.
Yep.
But definitely cool. Well, hey Bruce, thank you for this overview of
It's
Augustine.
definitely more interesting than I thought you were going to be.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
It is a compliment.
But I know we have a 10 out of 10 chance about getting a comment about not respecting the Pope by calling him Pope Bob. I do want to point out, though, Tradcaths have been making fun of Protestants for decades for listening to Pastor Bob, over the church. And now they have to listen to Pastor Bob. So
I think Bruce is right. I bet you we're not insulting him at all. He
I
likes
don't
it.
think, honestly, I wouldn't.
He's a true Chicago guy.
Yeah, you guys know me. I'm not someone who goes around insulting people, and I don't really think he would find that insulting in the least.
Me either.
And I will apologize if he listens to this and writes a letter and says that he does
I
not want to
won't.
be called His Holiness Pope Bob.
I will never call him his
can you
holiness.
actually imagine if we got like an email from the Vatican?
That'd be great.
wild.
That'd be so
It'd be in
bomb.
Latin.
So, well, hey, we appreciate your time.
We would be like, you thought we wouldn't be able to read this, but we can.
Yeah. It's in Latin. Oh my gosh. It's going to take me a while to respond. Oh, that's good. Well, hey, we thank you for listening to this episode of the Thank You Fellows podcast. Seriously, go watch the spin-off of this in 15 minutes or less. Bruce and I are going to sit down. I'm going to ask him a handful of questions about Augustine, and this time he's only going to have a couple of minutes to answer each of those questions. So we'll see what he comes up with there, and that should be fun. That's over on the YouTube channel at 1517, so definitely go subscribe there if you're interested in these topics. We will catch you next week. Bye.
Bye.